The neon buzz of the broken spoke sign flickered against the twilight, casting a long, dancing shadow across the dusty parking lot of the most legendary honky-tonk in Austin. But tonight, the music wasn't playing inside. The wooden dance floor, usually polished by the boots of 1,000 two-steppers, was silent. Sitting in the cab of his truck, with the engine idling low and steady, was a man whose face was known to every soul who had ever turned on a radio in the state of Texas. George Strait stared at the weathered facade of the bar, but his mind was 50 miles and 24 hours away. In his hand, trembling slightly not from age but from a sudden, piercing cold that had nothing to do with the December air, he held a small square of glossy paper. It was a photograph. The edges were frayed, the white border yellowed like old parchment, smelling faintly of tobacco and cedar. It had happened the night before in San Antonio. The AT&T Center had been a cauldron of noise and adoration. 50,000 people screaming his name, singing every word to Amarillo by morning, until the concrete foundations seemed to shake. But for George, the show was always the job. He loved it, he respected it, but the real world only started when the house lights went down and the silence returned. He had walked out the back exit, flanked by 3 security guards who were twice his size and half his age. The wind was biting, a rare Texas freeze that turned breath into clouds of white steam. He just wanted to get to the ranch. He wanted the fire, the silence of the brush country, and the soft voice of Norma asking him if he was hungry. That was when he saw her. The security team had formed a human wall, pushing back a small group of autograph hunters who had braved the freezing temperatures. Most were holding up smartphones, their screens glowing blue in the dark, shouting for a selfie, for a moment, for a piece of him. But there was one woman who didn't shout. She stood near the metal barricade, dressed in a coat that was threadbare at the elbows and far too thin for the weather. She wasn't holding a phone. She was holding her hands clasped against her chest, shivering violently. As a burly guard moved to block her view, barking at her to step back, George saw something in her eyes that stopped him dead in his tracks. It was a look of desperate, quiet dignity. It was the look of someone who had nowhere else to go and nothing left to lose. "Wait," George said, his voice low but cutting through the noise of the wind and the shouting fans. The security guard froze. George stepped away from the warm interior of the waiting SUV and walked toward the barricade. The other fans went silent, sensing a shift in the atmosphere. The king of country was not smiling his famous easy smile. His face was etched with concern. He approached the woman, taking off his glove. "I am sorry about them, ma'am," George said, his Texas drawl thick and comforting like warm honey. "You look like you're freezing. You ought to be inside." The woman, who looked to be in her late 30s but carried the weariness of someone much older, didn't ask for a signature. She didn't ask for money. She simply unclenched her hands and held out the photograph. Her fingers were red and raw from the cold. "My daddy told me to give this to you," she whispered. Her voice was so faint the wind almost stole it away. "He said you wouldn't remember his name. He said nobody remembers his name, but he said you were the only one who ever really saw him." George took the photo. He looked down at it under the harsh glare of the security floodlights. The image was grainy, a Polaroid from 1973. The background was unmistakable to him, even after half a century. The lush, volcanic green of Schofield Barracks in Hawaii. In the foreground, sitting on an overturned crate with a cheap acoustic guitar, was a very young George Strait. His hair was short, military regulation, and his smile was wide and carefree. But sitting next to him, hunched over, looking at the ground with a hollowness that was terrifying to behold, was another soldier. A skinny boy with dark hair and ears that stuck out slightly. George stared at the boy in the photo. He searched the filing cabinets of his memory, spanning decades of faces, band members, roadies, fans, and family. He remembered the guitar. He remembered the humidity of Hawaii. He remembered the smell of the mess hall. But he did not remember the boy. He looked up to ask the woman her name, to ask who her father was. But the security team, sensing a delay in the schedule, had surged forward to clear the path for a departing equipment truck. In the confusion, the woman had stepped back. "Please," George called out, taking a step toward the barricade. Who was he? The woman looked at him, tears finally spilling over her wind-burned cheeks. She didn't answer directly. She just said one last thing before turning into the shadows of the parking lot. "He died this morning, Mr. Straight. This was the only thing he wanted me to do. Merry Christmas." And then she was gone, swallowed by the darkness and the diesel fumes of the idling buses. Now sitting in his truck outside the Broken Spoke, George ran his thumb over the face of the unknown soldier. The guilt was a heavy stone in his gut. George prided himself on treating people right. He was raised to look a man in the eye, to shake his hand, and to remember him. How could he have sat next to this man, played music with him, and completely erased him from his history? He put the truck in gear and pulled out onto South Lamar, heading toward the highway. The drive to the ranch was usually his time to decompress, to listen to the local AM radio stations checking cattle prices or playing old Merle Haggard tunes. Tonight, he drove in silence. The tires hummed against the asphalt, eating up the miles as the city lights of San Antonio faded in the rearview mirror, replaced by the vast, ink-black darkness of the Texas Hill Country. When he finally turned onto the gravel road leading to his property, the gate swung open automatically, welcoming him into his sanctuary. The main house was glowing with warm yellow light. A massive Christmas tree stood in the front window, visible from the driveway, decked out in lights that twinkled against the glass. It was a picture of success, of a life well lived, of the American dream realized through hard work, and a voice that God had touched. But as George parked the truck and killed the engine, he felt like a fraud. He walked into the house, his boots echoing softly on the hardwood floors. Norma was in the kitchen, making tea. She turned as he entered, her face lighting up with the smile that had been his anchor since high school. "You're home early," she said, walking over to kiss his cheek. She pulled back immediately, reading his face with the precision of a woman who had known him for 50 years. "George, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." "I think I might have, Norma," George said quietly. He walked over to the kitchen island and placed the photo on the marble countertop. Norma put down her tea towel and leaned in, adjusting her glasses. She studied the picture for a long moment. "That's you. Hawaii. You look so young. Who is that with you?" "I don't know," George said, his voice cracking slightly. "That's the problem. A woman gave this to me tonight, said her daddy died this morning, said I was the only one who saw him." "Norma, look at his face. Look at that boy's face." Norma looked closer. The boy in the photo wasn't just sad. He looked broken. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting for a breeze to push him over. "He looks like he's in pain," Norma whispered. George took off his hat and ran a hand through his hair. "I was sitting right there, Norma. I was playing guitar. I was probably singing some Folsom Prison blues, laughing, thinking about coming home to you. And this boy was sitting 2 feet away from me, looking like the world was ending. And I don't remember his name. I don't remember a single conversation. Maybe it was just a quick photo, George," Norma said soothingly, placing a hand on his arm. "You took thousands of photos even back then. You were always the guy with the guitar." "No," George shook his head. "Look at the way we're sitting. The crates are pulled up close. There are 2 empty beer bottles on the ground between us. We weren't posing. Someone took this while we were hanging out. I spent time with him, and now his daughter is out there somewhere, probably alone, grieving, and she thinks I was his best friend." George picked up the photo again and turned it over. In the dim light of the arena, he hadn't checked the back. Now, under the bright kitchen halogen, he saw the faint, scrawled handwriting in blue ink. The ink was faded, barely legible. "Deck 24, 1973. The night the music saved my life. Thank you, GS." George felt the air leave his lungs. December 24th. Christmas Eve. He walked to the window and looked out at the dark expanse of his ranch. The mesquite trees were silhouettes against the moon. He thought about that Christmas Eve in 1973. He had been homesick. He missed Texas. He missed Norma. He remembered sitting outside the barracks because it was too hot inside. He remembered playing for hours. And slowly, like a fog lifting off a pond at sunrise, a fragment of memory returned. He remembered a soldier who had been crying. Not loud sobbing, but that silent, shaking kind of crying that men do when they think no one is watching. George remembered stopping his song. He remembered offering the boy a beer. He remembered the boy saying he was going to go AWOL, that he couldn't take the discipline, the shouting, the distance from home. He was going to walk into the jungle and not come back. George had stayed up with him. He hadn't given him a speech, he hadn't quoted regulations, he had just played. He played every song he knew. He told stories about Pearsall, about the rodeo, about the girl waiting for him. He treated the boy like a human being, not a rank and serial number. By dawn, the boy had stopped shaking. He had picked up his rifle and gone back to formation. "I remember," George whispered. He turned back to Norma, his eyes burning with intensity. "I remember him. I don't know his name, but I remember the night. I talked him down, Norma. He was going to run. Maybe worse. I just sat there and played." Norma's eyes filled with tears. "You saved him, George, and now he's gone," George said, the weight of the realization settling on him. "And his daughter, Norma, you should have seen her. She didn't have a car coat. She had holes in her shoes. She looked like she hadn't eaten a warm meal in days. She gave me this photo and walked away into the freeze. If her daddy died this morning and she's out there like that..." He didn't have to finish the sentence. Norma was already moving. She went to the drawer where they kept the notepad and grabbed a pen. "What do we know?" she asked, her voice firm. "We know she was at the AT&T Center. We know she was at the artist exit around 11 p.m. We know she's local, or at least she's here now." "I'm calling the team," George said. He pulled out his phone. It was past midnight, but this couldn't wait. He dialed his tour manager, a man who could find a needle in a haystack if the needle was wearing a cowboy hat. "Tom? It's George. I need you to wake up. I need the security footage from the loading dock exit. Tonight, about 40 minutes after the show ended, there was a woman, brown hair, maybe late 30s, wearing a thin grey coat. She handed me a photo. I need to know where she went. I need to know if she got into a car, a bus, or if she walked." He listened for a moment, pacing the kitchen floor. "I don't care what time it is, Tom. Wake up the venue security director. Tell him it's me. Tell him it's an emergency. I'm not going to sleep until I know who she is." George hung up and looked at the photo again. The inscription haunted him. "The night the music saved my life." He had spent 40 years chasing hits, chasing number ones, worrying about ticket sales and radio play. He had built an empire. But looking at that handwriting, he realized that the most important concert he ever played wasn't in the Astrodome. It wasn't in Vegas. It was on a humid night in Hawaii, playing for an audience of one, for no money, just to keep a scared kid from giving up. And now that kid's legacy was in trouble. 50 miles away on the outskirts of San Antonio, the reality was far harsher than the warm kitchen of the Strait Ranch. The wind rattled the loose aluminum siding of a single wide trailer in a park that had seen better days decades ago. Inside, Clara wrapped herself in a scratchy wool blanket, sitting on a sofa with exposed springs. The small propane heater in the corner sputtered and died. The last of the fuel, exhausted. She held her breath, hoping it would kick back on, but the silence that followed was final. The cold began to creep in immediately, seeping through the thin walls under the door, settling into her bones. On the small, chipped coffee table sat a folded American flag, a stack of unpaid medical bills that amounted to more than she could earn in 10 years, and an empty frame where the photo of George and her father used to be. She had done it. She had fulfilled his last wish. It had cost her the last of the gas money to get to the arena, and she had to beg the parking attendant to let her old sedan sit in the lot for 10 minutes. But she had seen him. She had seen the king. And for a brief second she saw the recognition of humanity in his eyes. That was enough. It had to be enough. Her stomach growled, a painful reminder that she had skipped dinner to afford the parking. She looked around the trailer. Tomorrow was Christmas Eve. The landlord had been by yesterday. The eviction notice was taped to the front door, flapping in the wind like a white flag of surrender. She had until the 26th to vacate. Her father's long battle with cancer had taken everything: the savings, the car, the house they used to rent, and finally, his life. She picked up the folded flag and held it tight. "Daddy, I gave it to him," she whispered into the freezing room. "I hope he keeps it." Back at the ranch, the phone rang. George snatched it up before the second ring. "Yeah? It's Tom." The voice on the other end was groggy but alert. "We got the footage. The venue security guy is a fan, luckily. He pulled the tapes. We tracked her. She walked out of the pedestrian gate and got into a 2004 Toyota Corolla. Rust on the wheel wells. We got a partial plate. "Read it to me," George said, grabbing the pen from Norma's hand. George wrote down the numbers and letters. "I ran it through a buddy at the DMV," Tom continued. "It's registered to a James Miller. Deceased as of this morning. Address is listed at the Shady Grove Trailer Park off Highway 87. George, that's a rough spot." James Miller, George said the name, testing the weight of it on his tongue. It sounded familiar now. Jimmy. The boy in Hawaii was named Jimmy. "Thanks, Tom. Go back to sleep." George hung up. He looked at Norma. His eyes were no longer filled with confusion. They were filled with the steely determination that had made him a champion roper before he was a singer. It was the look of a man who had a job to do. "I know where she is," George said. Norma was already walking toward the closet where they kept the heavy winter coats. "I'll pack a basket. Food. Blankets. We have that ham in the fridge." "No," George said gently. "Not yet. I need to go alone first. I need to see if... I need to make this right, man to man, or man to daughter. This is something I started in 1973. I have to finish it." He grabbed his black felt hat and settled it low on his brow. He picked up the photo and tucked it into his shirt pocket, right over his heart. "I'm taking the dually," he said. "It's got 4-wheel drive. If she's where Tom says she is, the roads are going to be bad." Norma kissed him. "Bring her here, George. If she's alone, bring her home." "I intend to," he said. George walked out into the cold night. The wind was howling now, bending the oak trees. He climbed into his massive truck, the engine roaring to life like a waking beast. He backed out, the headlights sweeping across the ranch he had built with his songs. But tonight, he wasn't driving as George Strait the superstar. He was driving as Specialist 4th Class Strait United States Army on a mission to rescue a fallen comrade's family. The drive to Shady Grove was grim. As he left the wealthy ranch lands and entered the outskirts of the city, the scenery changed. The houses got smaller, the fences more broken. The Christmas lights became scarce, replaced by dark windows and empty porches. When he turned into the trailer park, his headlights illuminated rows of metal boxes that looked like they were huddled together for warmth. The road was full of potholes filled with ice. A stray dog barked at his truck, its breath steaming in the air. George slowed down, checking the numbers painted on the sides of the trailers. 12, 14, 16. He stopped in front of number 18. It was dark, no lights, no Christmas tree. Just a beat-up Corolla parked in the dirt. George killed the engine and stepped out. The silence here was different than the ranch. It was a heavy, oppressive silence. He walked up the creaking wooden steps to the metal door. He saw the eviction notice taped there, fluttering violently in the wind. He ripped it off and read it in the moonlight. Eviction for non-payment, fund $200 past due. $1,200. He made that in the time it took him to tune his guitar. The injustice of it made his blood boil. He folded the notice and put it in his pocket. He knocked on the door. 3 solid raps. Inside, Clara jumped. She had dozed off under the blanket. Terror seized her. It was 2 a.m. Who would be knocking? The landlord? The police? Had something happened to the car? She didn't move. Maybe they would go away. George knocked again. "Mom? It's George. From the arena." Clara's heart stopped. She stumbled off the couch, her legs numb from the cold. She walked to the door, her hands shaking so bad she could barely undo the latch. She opened it a crack. There, standing on her rotting porch, illuminated by the moon and the distant street lamp, was the silhouette of the cowboy. The hat, the jacket, the jawline. "Mr. Strait?" she whispered, disbelief coloring every syllable. "Open the door, darling," George said softly. "It's freezing out here, and I know it ain't much warmer in there." Clara opened the door wide. George stepped in, and the sheer size of the man seemed to fill the tiny room. He immediately felt the cold. It was colder inside than outside because the metal walls held the chill like an icebox. He saw the empty heater. He saw the folded flag. He saw the empty picture frame. He took off his hat, holding it against his chest. "I remembered," he said, looking her in the eye. "His name was Jimmy, Jimmy Miller. He was from Ohio originally, right? Clara sobbed, a sound that broke from her throat like a physical pain. Yes, he was. He played harmonica, George continued, the memories flooding back now that he was in the presence of Jimmy's blood. He was terrible at it, but he played. And that night, Christmas Eve, he showed me a picture of a baby girl he had back home. He said he had to stay alive to meet her. Clara fell to her knees, burying her face in her hands. That was me. I was 6 months old. George dropped to one knee, ignoring the dirt on the floor, ignoring the status that separated them. He put a hand on her shoulder. His hand was warm, strong, and calloused. He stayed alive, Clara. He made it home. And because he made it home, you're here. And because you're here, I'm here. George stood up and looked around the trailer. He looked at the eviction notice in his pocket, then at the empty heater. Pack a bag, he said. What? Clara looked up, confused. Pack a bag. You can't stay here. Not tonight. Not on Christmas Eve. I can't, Mr. Straight. I don't have anywhere to go. This is all I have. Not anymore, George said. He walked over to the heater and touched it. Stone cold. He looked at the medical bills. Your daddy was a brother to me for one night that mattered more than I knew. In the army, we don't leave people behind. I left him behind once because I didn't know. I forgot. I'm not making that mistake twice. But my car, Clara stammered. Leave it, George said firmly. We'll send someone for it tomorrow. Right now, my truck is warm, and my wife Norma has a ham that's probably big enough to feed this whole trailer park. But she's waiting for you. Clara stood up, wiping her tears. Why? Why would you do this? I'm nobody. George smiled then, that crooked, genuine smile that had charmed millions. You're the daughter of the man who listened to me play when nobody else cared. You're the reason I know my music actually did something worth a damn. You're not nobody, Clara, you're family. As Clara went to the back room to throw a few things into a plastic bag, George stood by the door, guarding the entrance. He looked out at the bleak trailer park. He knew this wasn't the end of the problems. There were debts to be paid. There was a funeral to arrange. There was a life to rebuild. But for tonight, the mission was simple. Get her to safety. Get her to warmth. Clara emerged a minute later, clutching the folded flag and a small bag. She looked at George, fear and hope warring in her eyes. Ready? George asked. Ready, she whispered. George held the door open for her. As she stepped out onto the porch, the wind gusted again, but this time George stepped between her and the wind, blocking the chill with his own body. He walked her to the truck, opened the heavy door, and helped her up into the leather seat that smelled of saddle soap and expensive cologne. As he walked around to the driver's side, he looked up at the winter sky. The stars were bright and hard. Merry Christmas, Jimmy, he said softly to the air. I got her. He climbed in, started the engine and turned the truck back toward the ranch, leaving the darkness of the trailer park behind. But the story wasn't over. The past has a way of revealing more than just names, and as they drove into the night, George had no idea that the contents of the bag Clara had packed, specifically an old journal of her father's, held secrets about that night in Hawaii that would challenge everything George thought he knew about his own history. The interior of the Ford F-450 was a capsule of silence and warmth, insulated from the howling Texas wind outside. The dashboard glowed with a soft amber light, illuminating the weary face of the king of country and the terrified, exhausted profile of the woman sitting next to him. For the first 10 miles, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the low hum of the heavy-duty tires on the asphalt and the rhythmic thrum of the heater blasting warm air into the cab. Clara sat with her hands clenched in her lap, staring out the window at the passing darkness. The landscape was a blur of shadows, mesquite trees, fence posts, the occasional distant light of a farmhouse. She felt like she was in a dream, a hallucination brought on by hunger and grief. One moment she was freezing in a tin can, waiting for the sheriff to come and throw her out. The next she was sitting in a leather seat that cost more than her father made in a year, driven by a man whose face was on half the billboards in the state. She glanced sideways at George. He drove with one hand on the wheel, his eyes fixed on the road, his expression unreadable. He wasn't the superstar right now. He was just a man driving a truck. I shouldn't be here, Clara whispered, breaking the silence. The words felt heavy in the quiet cab. George didn't look over, but his grip on the steering wheel tightened slightly. Why's that? Because, look at me, Mr. Straight. I'm a mess. I haven't showered in 2 days because the water got cut off. My clothes smell like kerosene from the heater. I don't belong in a truck like this. I don't belong where you're taking me. George slowly turned his head, his blue eyes catching the light from the dashboard. Listen to me, Clara, and listen good, because I don't like repeating myself. That truck doesn't care who sits in it. The road doesn't care, and I sure as hell don't care about how you smell or what you're wearing. You are Jimmy Miller's daughter. That makes you royalty in my book tonight. But why? Clara asked, her voice trembling. You didn't know him. You met him once, 50 years ago. Why does that matter so much? George sighed, a deep sound that seemed to come from the bottom of his boots. He looked back at the road, the headlights cutting a swath through the black night. Because, Clara, memory is a tricky thing. I thought I'd forgotten him. But the moment I saw that picture, I realized he's been with me the whole time. You know, in the army, you meet a lot of guys, they come and go. But that night, Christmas Eve in Hawaii, it wasn't just him who was hurting. Clara looked at him surprised. You? But you were George Straight. No, George shook his head, a wry smile touching his lips. I wasn't George Straight then. I was just a kid named George. I was newly married to Norma. We had eloped in Mexico, and her daddy was furious. I was thousands of miles away from the woman I loved, stuck on an island, wondering if I'd ever make it back to Texas, wondering if I was good enough to be a husband, let alone a singer. I was scared, Clara, just as scared as your daddy. He paused, letting the confession hang in the air. When I sat down with Jimmy that night, I wasn't playing music to save him. I was playing to keep myself from falling apart. We saved each other. He just never told you that part. Clara felt tears prick her eyes again. He never told me anything about you being scared. He just said you were the strongest man he ever met. He said you sat on that crate like a king on a throne. That's what he needed to see, George said softly. So that's what I showed him, that's the job. But tonight I don't have to be the king, I can just be George. And George is telling you that you're going to be okay. They turned off the main highway and onto the private road leading to the ranch. As the main house came into view, Clara gasped. It wasn't just a house, it was a sprawling hacienda of stone and timber, glowing with golden light against the backdrop of the hills. The Christmas lights wrapped around the massive oak trees in the front yard were tasteful but abundant, creating a canopy of stars that rivaled the sky above. George pulled the truck up to the front entrance. Before he could even put it in park, the front door of the house opened. Norma Straight stepped out onto the porch, wrapped in a thick wool shawl, the wind catching her silver hair. George killed the engine. He turned to Clara. That's Norma. She's the real boss of this outfit. Don't let her height fool you. He hopped out and walked around to open Clara's door. He offered her his hand. Clara hesitated for a second, looking at her dirty fingernails, then looked at his open palm. She took it. His grip was firm and stabilizing as she stepped down onto the paved driveway. Norma was already walking down the steps, her arms open. She didn't hesitate. She didn't look at Clara's worn shoes or her matted hair. She walked straight up to her and pulled her into a hug that smelled of lavender and baking bread. You must be frozen to the bone, child, Norma said, pulling back to look at Clara's face. Her eyes were kind, filled with a motherly warmth that broke down Clara's last defenses. I'm sorry to intrude, Mrs. Straight, Clara managed to choke out. Hush, Norma said firmly. It's Christmas. The only intrusion on Christmas is an empty chair at the table. Come inside. They led her into the house. The warmth hit Clara like a physical wave. The air smelled of pine, cinnamon, and roasting ham. The foyer was larger than her entire trailer, with a ceiling that soared 2 stories high. To the right, a fire roared in a stone fireplace big enough to stand in. Norma guided her to a plush armchair near the fire. Sit. Don't you dare move. I'm bringing you something hot. George hung his hat on the rack and took off his heavy jacket. He watched Clara sink into the chair, her eyes wide as she took in the room, the platinum records on the walls, the saddles displayed like art, the photos of grandchildren. It was a museum of a life she couldn't comprehend, yet here she was, sitting in the center of it. Norma returned from the kitchen with a tray, a steaming mug of soup, a plate piled high with ham, biscuits and green beans, and a pot of tea. She set it on the small table beside Clara. "Eat," Norma commanded gently. Clara picked up the fork. Her hand shook so badly she almost dropped it. She took a bite of the ham. The flavor exploded in her mouth, salty, sweet, rich. It was the first real food she had eaten in 3 days. She tried to maintain her dignity, to eat slowly, but her body betrayed her. She ate ravenously, tears streaming down her face and mixing with the food. George stood by the mantel, leaning against the stone, watching her. He didn't look away. He bore witness to her hunger, just as he had borne witness to her father's despair. He felt a rage building inside him, not at her, but at a world where a veteran's daughter could go hungry in a country her father swore to defend. When the plate was clean, Clara sat back, exhausted. The warmth of the fire and the food was making her eyelids heavy. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know how to thank you." "You just did," George said. "By eating." Norma stepped in. "The guest room is ready. I put out some fresh towels and a nightgown. It might be a little big, it's mine, but it's warm flannel. The bathroom is en suite. Take a hot shower, soak as long as you want. Sleep as late as you need." Clara stood up, clutching the plastic bag she had brought from the trailer. Inside was the flag and the journal. Can I show you something first?" Clara asked, looking at George. "Of course," George said. Clara reached into the bag and pulled out a small leather-bound notebook. The cover was cracked and stained with water and oil. It looked ancient. "My daddy wrote in this every day he was in the service," she said. "I haven't read all of it. It hurts too much. But I read the entry from December 24th, 1973. I think you should hear it. Not just what he told me, but what he wrote in the moment." George walked over and took the book. His hands, usually so steady on a fretboard, felt a tremor. He opened the book. The pages were brittle. He found the date. The handwriting was jagged, frantic, written by a man on the edge. George adjusted his reading glasses and began to read aloud, his voice low and gravelly in the quiet room. "Christmas Eve, Schofield Barracks, I'm done. I can't do this anymore. The noise in my head won't stop. I miss Ohio. I miss the smell of snow. This jungle is eating me alive. I was going to walk out tonight. I have the path mapped out. Just disappear. Let the jungle take me. Maybe then the fear will stop." George paused. The room was silent. Norma reached out and took his free hand. He continued reading. "I was sitting by the latrines checking my boots one last time when the guitar man came out, straight. The country boy from Texas. He sat down on a crate next to me. I thought he was going to report me. I thought he saw the look in my eye. But he didn't say a word about regulations. He just handed me a warm beer and started playing Silent Night. But he played it sad. He played it like he was crying through the strings." George's voice caught. He cleared his throat and read on. "He stopped playing after a while and looked at me. He said, 'Miller, I don't know about you, but I feel like I'm drowning tonight. I miss my girl so much. It feels like my chest is caved in. If I stop playing, I think I might just lay down and not get up. So I need you to sit there. I need you to listen. Because if you leave, I'm playing to the dark, and the dark don't listen back.' That's when I realized he wasn't saving me. He needed me. He needed a witness. So I stayed. I stayed for him. And because I stayed, I saw the sun come up. And if the sun can come up after a night like this, maybe I can make it too." George closed the book slowly. He stared at the leather cover. "He stayed for me," George whispered, the revelation hitting him with the force of a physical blow. "He didn't stay because I was strong. He stayed because I was weak. He stayed because I admitted I was hurting." He looked up at Clara. His eyes were wet. "Your daddy saved my life, Clara. If he had walked into that jungle, if I had been left alone on that crate, I might have packed it in. I might have gone home, quit the army the wrong way, maybe never picked up a guitar again. Everything I have, this house, this career, it's built on the fact that your daddy sat there and listened to me when I was at my lowest." Clara was weeping silently. "I never knew," she said. "He always made you sound like a superhero." "That's what fathers do," George said. "They protect their kids from the truth. But the truth is we were just two scared boys holding on to each other in the dark." Norma squeezed George's hand, then turned to Clara. "Go get some rest, honey. You're safe here. And you're not a guest. You're family." Clara nodded and followed Norma down the hall. George stayed by the fire. He held the journal against his chest. He looked at the massive Christmas tree, at the twinkling lights. He thought about the 50 years that had passed. 50 Christmases. He had spent them surrounded by family, by abundance. Jimmy Miller had spent them struggling, fighting, but staying alive for his daughter. George didn't sleep that night. He sat in the leather armchair, watching the embers of the fire die down, reading the journal cover to cover. He read about Jimmy's return to Ohio, his struggle to find work, the death of his wife, the birth of Clara. He read about the cancer diagnosis. He read about the pride Jimmy felt every time he saw George on TV. "There he is," one entry read from 1995. "The cowboy rides away. Go get him, George. Sing one for us." By the time the sun began to paint the Texas sky in hues of purple and orange, George had a plan. But plans in the real world are rarely simple. Christmas morning broke with a brilliant, cold sunshine. The smell of coffee permeated the house. Clara woke up in a bed that felt like a cloud. For a moment she panicked, not knowing where she was. Then the memories of the night before came flooding back. She sat up, pulling the flannel robe around her. She walked out into the kitchen. Norma was already there, pulling cinnamon rolls out of the oven. George was at the table, dressed in a fresh, starch-white shirt and jeans, drinking coffee. He looked up and smiled. "Merry Christmas, Clara." "Merry Christmas," she replied, feeling shy. Before she could sit down, her phone buzzed in the pocket of her discarded coat on the chair. It was a harsh, jarring sound in the peaceful kitchen. She pulled it out. The screen was cracked, but the number was visible. It was a local number she knew too well. She hesitated. "Answer it," George said softly. "Whatever it is, we'll handle it," Clara answered. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was shrill and impatient. It wasn't a recording. It was Mrs. Gable, the property manager for the trailer park, a woman who wore too much perfume and had a heart made of flint. "Clara? This is Brenda Gable. I see your car is still here, but you're not. I'm at the trailer. We have a problem." Clara's hand gripped the phone. "It's Christmas morning, Mrs. Gable. Can't this wait?" "No, it cannot wait," the woman snapped. "I have a buyer for the lot who wants to clear the site before the new year. I'm here with the locksmith. We're doing an inventory. And frankly, looking at the state of this place, I don't think your security deposit is going to cover the hauling fees for this junk. And I see a lot of medical bills on the table. If you want any of your father's things, you need to be here in an hour with the back rent in cash. Otherwise, it's all going into the dumpster." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. "You can't throw away his things, please. It's Christmas. Business is business, honey. 1 hour." Clara lowered the phone. She looked at George, terror in her eyes. "She's at the trailer. She's going to throw everything away. She wants the money now." George set his coffee cup down. The ceramic made a sharp click against the saucer. He stood up. He didn't look angry. He looked focused. He looked like he was about to enter the chute at the rodeo, waiting for the gate to open. "She's at the trailer now?" George asked. "Yes, with a locksmith." George looked at Norma. "Keep the cinnamon rolls warm. We'll be back." He walked over to the wall where the keys to the trucks hung. He grabbed the keys to the dually again. Then he opened a drawer in the hallway console and pulled out a checkbook. He tucked it into his shirt pocket. "Put your coat on, Clara," George said, his voice calm but with an edge of steel that she hadn't heard before. "We're going back?" Clara asked. "We're going back," George said, putting on his black hat and adjusting the brim. "And Mrs. Gable is about to learn the difference between business and a bad mistake." The drive back to the trailer park was faster this time. The morning traffic was non-existent. George drove with a purpose. He asked Clara questions about the debts. "How much is the rent?" $1,200 back due, but there's late fees, probably $1,500. "And the medical bills?" Clara looked down. "A lot. Daddy's treatments were expensive, maybe $40,000. "I don't know." I stopped opening the envelopes. George nodded. He didn't flinch at the number. He just kept driving. When they pulled into the Shady Grove trailer park, the scene was a stark contrast to the quiet dignity of the ranch. A bright red convertible was parked next to Clara's rusted Corolla. The door to Clara's trailer was wide open. A woman in a fur coat was standing on the porch, pointing at things inside, while a man in coveralls dragged a box out the door. "That's my daddy's tool chest," Clara screamed, opening the truck door before George had fully stopped. "Wait, Clara," George commanded, but she was already running. George put the truck in park. He stepped out, his boots crunching on the frozen gravel. He adjusted his jacket and began to walk toward the trailer. He didn't run. He walked with the slow, deliberate stride of a man who owns the ground he walks on. Clara was struggling with the man in coveralls. "Put it down. That was his." Mrs. Gable turned, her face twisted in annoyance. "Clara, stop making a scene. You didn't bring the money, did you? I told you—" "Excuse me, ma'am." The voice was not loud, but it cut through the cold air like a whip crack. Mrs. Gable stopped. The man in coveralls stopped. They both turned to look at the figure approaching them. The sun was behind George, casting a long shadow. He was dressed in denim and black leather, his hat shading his eyes. But as he stepped closer, the sunlight hit his face. Mrs. Gable's jaw dropped. Her eyes went wide. She looked from Clara to the man, then back to the man. "Is there a problem here?" George asked, stopping at the foot of the stairs. He rested his hand on the railing. Mrs. Gable stammered. She adjusted her fur coat nervously. This is an eviction proceeding. Are you George Strait?" "I am," George said simply. "And this lady is my guest, and that tool chest belongs to a hero of the United States Army. So I'd appreciate it if your man there would put it back inside." Gently. The man in coveralls dropped the box immediately, as if it were red hot. "Sorry, Mr. Strait, I didn't know." Mrs. Gable recovered her composure slightly. She was a businesswoman after all, and money was money, even if it involved a celebrity. "Well, Mr. Strait, it's an honor. Truly. But Clara here owes 3 months' rent plus late fees, and the owner of the park wants the lot cleared. Unless you're planning on playing a concert for us, the eviction stands." George walked up the stairs, past the stunned workman, and stood face to face with Mrs. Gable. He towered over her. "I'm not here to sing, Mrs. Gable. I'm here to settle accounts." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the checkbook. He also pulled out a pen. "How much for the trailer?" George asked. "Excuse me?" "The trailer. And the lot it sits on. How much to buy the land under this tin can so this woman never has to worry about you knocking on her door again?" Mrs. Gable blinked. "The lot isn't really for sale individually. It's part of the park." "Everything is for sale," George said calmly. "Name a price, a fair price. And remember, it's Christmas, and I have a lot of friends in the zoning department in Austin who would love to hear about how you conduct evictions on holidays." Mrs. Gable swallowed hard. 20,000 for the lot and the unit. George didn't blink. He wrote on the check. He ripped it out and handed it to her. 25,000, George said. "That covers the purchase, the back rent, and a generous tip for you to get in your car and leave right now." He turned to the workman. "Put the box back inside, son. Then go home to your family." The workman nodded vigorously and lugged the heavy chest back into the trailer. Mrs. Gable looked at the check. Her hands were shaking. "Mr. Strait." "Merry Christmas, Mrs. Gable," George said, turning his back on her. He looked at Clara. She was standing in the dirt, her hands over her mouth, sobbing uncontrollably. "It's yours, Clara," George said from the porch. "Nobody can ever kick you out again." But the story wasn't done. As Mrs. Gable scurried to her car, George walked down to Clara. He put an arm around her. "That fixes the roof," he said. "Now let's talk about those medical bills, and let's talk about what you're going to do with the rest of your life. Because I have a feeling Jimmy Miller didn't stay alive just so you could live in a trailer park. He had bigger dreams for you, and so do I." Just then another car pulled up, a sleek black sedan. 2 men in suits stepped out. They weren't debt collectors, they were George's attorneys. He had called them on the drive over. George looked at Clara. "I told you, we don't leave people behind. I'm setting up a trust for you, and we're going to start a foundation in your father's name. But first," He gestured to the trailer. Grab whatever you want to keep. Photos, the flag, the tools. Because you're not staying here tonight either. You're coming back to the ranch. We have a Christmas dinner to eat. Clara looked at the man who had changed her life in the span of 12 hours. Why? She asked again. Because 50 years ago your dad gave me a beer when I was thirsty, George said, his voice thick with emotion. I'm just buying the next round. The drive back to the ranch from the Shady Grove trailer park was different. The silence in the cab was no longer heavy with fear. It was pregnant with possibility. The winter sun was high now, bleaching the Texas landscape into a palette of pale golds and browns. In the back seat, the rusted tool chest sat secure, a relic of a life of hard labor saved from the landfill. Beside George, Clara slept. The adrenaline dump of the confrontation with Mrs. Gable, combined with the warmth of the truck, had finally knocked her out. George drove with one hand on the wheel, his other hand resting near his phone. He had already sent the text messages. The wheels were turning. By the time they crossed the cattle guard onto the straight property, the machinery of his influence was fully engaged. When they entered the house, the smell of the cinnamon rolls Norma had promised was gone, replaced by the savory, rich aroma of a full Christmas dinner: roast turkey, cornbread dressing, cranberry sauce. But the atmosphere in the house had shifted. It wasn't just a family holiday anymore, it was a command center. Two men in dark suits sat at the kitchen table, looking out of place amidst the festive decor. They were George's personal attorneys, men who usually handled contract negotiations for stadium tours. Today, they were handling something far more important. Norma met them at the door, putting a finger to her lips as she saw Clara's sleepy eyes. "Let her wake up slowly," Norma whispered. "The boys are here." Clara rubbed her eyes, looking at the suits. What's happening? George hung his hat on the rack. He turned to her, his face serious. "Clara, these gentlemen are here to handle the paperwork. We bought the land your trailer sits on, but that's just a patch. We need to fix the foundation." One of the lawyers, a man named Henderson, stood up. "Ms. Miller, we've already contacted the hospital network holding your father's debt. Mr. Straight has instructed us to negotiate a complete settlement." "Settlement?" Clara asked, her voice raspy. "I can't pay a settlement." "You won't," George said, walking over to the coffee pot. "I'm buying the debt, all of it, every penny. And then I'm forgiving it. As of tomorrow morning, you will owe nothing to anyone." Clara grabbed the back of a chair to steady herself. The room seemed to spin. $40,000, you just... "It's done," George said. "But that's the easy part. Writing a check is easy. What comes next is the work." He gestured to the tool chest that George had carried in and placed by the fireplace. "We need to open that," George said. "There's something in there I need to see." Clara knelt by the battered red metal box. It was covered in stickers from unions and job sites. She undid the latches. They snapped open with a loud metallic clack. Inside, it smelled of grease and sawdust, the perfume of the working man. There were wrenches, hammers, a level. But tucked in the bottom tray, wrapped in a grease rag, was a shoebox. Clara lifted it out. Inside were letters, photos, and a cassette tape recorder with a single tape inside. The label on the tape read, "For George, if you ever find him." George felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. He walked over and sat on the hearth. "Play it," he said. Clara pressed play. The hiss of magnetic tape filled the silent living room. Then a voice cut through the static. It was raspy, weak, the voice of a man whose lungs were failing, but the tone was unmistakable. "Hey, George, it's Jimmy Miller, from the 25th Infantry." Clara covered her mouth, tears instantly springing to her eyes. George leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. "I don't know if you'll ever hear this. Clara promised she'd try to find you when I'm gone. I didn't want to bother you while I was alive. You're the king now. You belong to the world. But I wanted to tell you, I kept my promise." The voice on the tape paused to cough, a wet, painful sound. "That night in Hawaii, when you told me to hold on, you said, 'Miller, you gotta live so you can tell the story.' Well, I lived. I didn't get rich. I didn't get famous. But I raised a daughter who has a heart of gold. And every time I wanted to quit, Every time the cancer got bad or the bills piled up, I'd put on one of your records. I'd hear your voice, and I'd be back on that crate, drinking that warm beer, knowing that I wasn't alone. George wiped a tear from his cheek with a rough knuckle. You saved me, George, but I never told you the other part. That night I stole your guitar pick, the tortoiseshell one. I kept it in my wallet every day for 50 years. It's in this box. Give it back to him, Clara. Tell him it played the soundtrack to a good life. The tape clicked off. Silence reigned in the room. The lawyers were staring at their papers, ashamed to look up. Norma was openly weeping. Clara reached into the box and found a small velvet pouch. She opened it and tipped it into her hand. There, worn smooth by 50 years of being rubbed like a worry stone, was a simple guitar pick. She held it out to George. George took it. It was small, insignificant to the naked eye, but to him, it weighed more than all the gold records on his walls. He held it up to the light. He remembered that pick. He remembered losing it and thinking it had fallen in the mud. He kept it, George whispered. He kept it all this time. He stood up, and the energy in the room changed. The sadness evaporated, replaced by a burning resolve. Henderson, George barked at the lawyer. Yes, sir. Draft the papers for the foundation, the Jimmy Miller Veterans Fund. Its purpose is to provide emergency housing and debt relief for veterans' families. I'm seeding it with $1 million. The lawyer's pen flew across the notepad. Done. And Clara, George turned to her. You're not going back to work at the diner or wherever you were working. You're the executive director. You know what these families go through. You know the fear. You run the fund. I'll pay the salary. You help them. Clara looked at him, stunned. Mr. Straight, I don't know how to run a foundation. You know how to survive, George said. That's the only qualification that matters. We'll hire people to do the math. You provide the heart. But the climax was not in the paperwork. It was not in the money. The climax had to be in the music, because that was the language they both spoke. Get your coat, Clara, George said. Where are we going? We're going to Austin. To the Broken Spoke. But it's Christmas Day, it's closed. Not for me, George said. The sun was setting by the time they reached Austin. The Broken Spoke was dark, its neon sign buzzing against the twilight. But the parking lot was full. Word had gotten out. When George Strait makes a call, Texas listens. George had called the owner, an old friend. He had called a few local musicians. He had called the local news station. Inside, the low ceilings and wooden beams of the honky-tonk were filled with a hushed crowd. It wasn't the rowdy Saturday night crowd. It was locals, friends, veterans, and people who had heard the rumor that the king was in town. George led Clara through the back door. The smell of stale beer and history hit them. He walked her to the side of the stage. Stay here, he said. George walked onto the small stage. He didn't have his big band, he didn't have the lights, he just had an acoustic guitar and a microphone. The crowd erupted, a deafening roar in the small space. George held up a hand, and the room went instantly silent. Merry Christmas, everybody, George said. His voice was steady, the voice that had narrated the lives of millions. I know you all should be home with your families, and I thank you for coming out. But I had a debt to pay tonight, a debt that's 50 years overdue. He looked down at his guitar. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the old, worn tortoise-shell pick. He held it up. 50 years ago, on Christmas Eve, I was a scared kid in Hawaii. I was ready to pack it in. And a man named Jimmy Miller sat with me. He listened to me. He kept me honest. He kept me alive. The crowd listened, captivated. Jimmy died yesterday. He died broke, he died in pain. But he didn't die alone because he had his daughter, and he didn't die forgotten because he's got me. George gestured to the side of the stage. Folks, I want you to meet Clara Miller. Clara stepped out, blinded by the spotlight. The applause was tentative at first, then grew thunderous as the crowd sensed the emotion in the room. She stood next to George, looking small and fragile but standing tall. We're starting a fund today, George announced, for the Jimmy Millers of the world, for the guys who come home and fall through the cracks. But before we pass the hat, I want to play a song. I wrote this afternoon, on the drive over. It's for Jimmy. George placed the old pick on the strings. He strummed a G chord. The sound was rich, warm, and familiar. He began to sing. It wasn't a polished studio hit. It was raw. It was a ballad about jungles and snow, about silence and noise, about a guitar pick kept in a wallet like a holy relic. He held the plastic, I held the wood. We did the best that two boys could. He saved my soul with a quiet stare. In the humid heat of the island air, now the cowboy rides, but the soldier's gone, and I'm just here to sing his song. By the final chorus, there wasn't a dry eye in the broken spoke. Burly men in trucker hats were wiping their eyes. The bartender was crying into a rag. Clara stood center stage, tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling. For the first time in years, she was smiling. She felt her father in the room. He wasn't in the trailer. He wasn't in the hospital bed. He was here, in the music. When the song ended, George didn't say thank you. He didn't bow. He simply took the pick, kissed it, and handed it back to Clara. "Keep it safe," he whispered. The aftermath was a blur of flashes and handshakes, but George shielded Clara from the worst of it. They drove back to the ranch in the quiet hours of the night. The medical debt was gone. The eviction was a bad memory. The foundation was real. 6 months later, the Texas summer was in full swing. The heat shimmered off the asphalt. At the newly dedicated Jimmy Miller Veteran Center in San Antonio, a ribbon-cutting ceremony was taking place. It was a modest building, renovated and bright, designed to help veterans transition to civilian life. Clara stood at the podium. She looked different. Her hair was styled, her suit was sharp, but her eyes held the same depth. She spoke with confidence. She talked about her father not as a victim, but as a man who understood the power of presence. In the back row, wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses, trying to remain inconspicuous, sat George Strait. He wasn't there to make a speech. He wasn't there to take credit. He was just checking in. He watched Clara command the room. He saw a young veteran in a wheelchair approach her, and he saw Clara kneel down, hold his hand, and listen. Really listen, just like her father had done. George smiled. The circle was closed. He slipped out the back door before the press could spot him. He walked to his truck, the gravel crunching under his boots. He climbed in and started the engine. As he pulled out onto the highway, he turned on the radio. One of his old songs was playing. Amarillo by Morning. He turned it up. He reached into his pocket and felt for a new guitar pick. It was there. He thought about the mystery of life, how a random moment in 1973 could ripple through time, saving a career, then saving a life, then saving a legacy. He thought about the photo, now framed on his mantelpiece next to the pictures of his grandkids. The unknown soldier had a name now, and more importantly, he had a future. George Strait drove west, toward the setting sun and the ranch. The road went on forever, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he wasn't just driving away, he was driving towards something. He was driving home, knowing that somewhere Jimmy Miller was listening, finally at peace, tapping his foot to the rhythm of a life redeemed. The music faded, leaving only the sound of the wind and the tires on the Texas pavement, a steady, comforting hum that sounded a lot like a promise kept,